Well, welcome everyone. Hi, Laura. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I am doing good as can be. Thank you so much for joining. I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping and then we can get started. So, again, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And while everyone is just joining in, just let us know where you're tuning in from and calling us from. It's always very interesting to see folks from all over the world who join these sessions. And while everyone is sharing and joining in, I just wanted to share that I'm so excited about unpacking this topic, which is a hot button topic, has been a hot button topic for the last several years, and that is growth. Growth when it is in the context of product, or it can also be growth in the context of scaling product teams or scaling teams in general, business models, but then also in the context of what it means for our personal careers. So, all of this, I don't think I could have chosen another better person to hash it out with and talk with, and that is Laura. I'm going to be introducing Laura in just a little bit. And for those of you who are not familiar, Product Power Play is a special LinkedIn Live series that I started, I believe it was last year in January. And what I do here is I sit down with amazing leaders like Laura, and we have some real candid conversations about product, life, leadership, lessons learned, retrospection, and we do it in a way that is really embodying like real conversations between friends. So it's a two-way conversation. And I hope that everyone else who's joining us today also chimes in with your questions in the comments. And that way we can keep it really nice and flowing. Um, I'll introduce myself just very quickly a little bit, and then I'm going to be introducing Laura. Hi, everyone. I'm Bhaski Mukherjee, and I'm the founder of PMDojo. And for over 2 decades, I've been in product and growth and leadership in executive roles. And I'm really passionate about seeing more women in leadership roles, especially in tech industry. And I think being a woman, I would say, Laura, you would also probably argue with this. I don't think it's the same level field. So I don't even want to pretend that it's the same for women and men. But I strongly believe that, it is not a plain level field, and there are a lot of things that we can do. And what we do at PM Dojo is to really help women build the skills that are needed, especially in product, so that they can feel confident about managing their career, really leveling up and rising up to leadership roles. So that's something that we do, and it shouldn't take us 100 years to achieve workplace parity. That is also something that I really, really am passionate about. How are we doing this? We do this with our special programs like the Product Leadership Edge, which enable women PMs to build the skills and confidence and mindsets. We also partner with companies to help their teams level up and build the strategy and the leadership skills to solve these gnarly, messy problems that are there. And with that, I want to take some time to introduce Laura. I know Laura has some amazing things that she's done over so many years. If I miss anything, Laura, please do add. So Laura has been in the growth space for such a long time. I mean, from the time when I don't even think the growth term existed. So it's been like decades now, like 15, 16, 20 years now. It's been a long time. Currently, she's a VP of growth at a company called DigitalOcean. Many of you might be familiar. And Laura, there are quite a few people from PM Dojo who have been applying to some of the roles that you're currently filling in. So I'm keeping fingers crossed for
Great.
some of our community members.
Love it.
Um, and you've also been at Twillio. You actually started their growth team at Twillio, and you led them for 6+ years in 2015-ish, that time of the year, right? 2015, 2022, 23. You've also been at Amplitude, again, one very successful growth story, and you led their PLG motion and the self-serve paid motion. And anything else that you want to add that I might have missed?
Yeah, you got it. Basically, like I say, I started doing growth before like we knew what it was. I was an e-commerce manager, right? We didn't, there was this fun period in kind of the early 2010s when it was like there's, self-serve checkout and the ability to buy self-serve was just kind of starting to bloom, but we didn't have a core concept of how to go about optimizing that or even what to call someone who did. So it was fun because that's where a lot of my early learnings came from, actually is a company called Bandwidth that I joined before Twillio, which at the time that I joined, it was like around 50 people, very small. They're now public. They've had this really great story and path. But yeah, I learned a lot about what to do and what not to do with growth there early, and it was great to then bring that to Twilio. But yeah, that, and then I do some advisory, I do some angel investing. I really love. I think there's a lot of overlap between folks who do growth and love growth, and founders who build businesses and grow businesses. There's just a ton of similar energy there. So I just love that kind of cross pollination. But yes, that is me.
Awesome. I love it. I mean, your story and your journey has been really fascinating. And I was mentioning to you a few minutes back before, we were in the backstage, that I've been manifesting in some shape or form, talking with you for years, and really never had the courage to reach out, because I always invented stories to tell myself that, oh, Laura is never going to respond to me. And, I'm glad I reached out. The first time it didn't happen. The second time I reached out and sent you an email, and there you are, you responded, and here we are. A few months later, we're talking. So thank you again, for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Well, I am so happy to be here, and I'll reiterate, we were talking about this too, but it's like, you miss what is it? I think Michael Jordan said it. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Like, it's always good to reach. I think we all fall into that for various reasons at various times, where you kind of want to shoot your shot, but it's like, if you don't, guaranteed it's not going to happen. And the second thing, and this is something I also tell myself a lot, is because I myself obviously am guilty of it. Sometimes the first outreach, like, there's 1,000 reasons someone might not get back to you, or even the second, or even the third. Well, I've got 3 young kids, and work life is always insane. So I can't even tell you how many times someone has reached out to me. I'm like, oh yeah, I definitely want to get back to them, and then it will just fall off. And so I think it's just, this is all of our collective reminders: shoot your shot, and if at first you don't succeed, try again, because there's a million reasons why maybe the first shot didn't work out, and it might have nothing to do with someone's interest. But I am very, very happy to be here today.
Absolutely. When we were kids, wasn't there a poem about a spider who would climb up and then fall down, and then they would try again? I'm like, somewhere along the way, we just forgot that as adults, right? Because it's the same thing. You got to try, and bingo, and sometimes you just, like, I forget what the poem is now. It's like in my head right now.
I think there was some rain involved. I think it was maybe an itsy bitsy spider.
Bitsy spider. There you go.
Yeah.
Oh man. Okay. So let's get started to the main part. And again, I think for everyone who's joining us today, put in your questions. Both Laura and I can see those questions, and along the way, we will basically tackle them. So if there's anything that resonates with you, or maybe you're not clear, just add your questions in the comments directly on LinkedIn, and they will show on my site. So we will get this started. And again, Laura, let's keep this like friends talking with friends. You can ask me any questions. If I know the answer or have some perspective, I'm happy to share as well. So let's start with the first question, and let's kind of move back and rewind years and years and years as a child, Laura, the little girl. Looking back, what were some of your thoughts, aspirations, dreams, and coming back to where you're today? Is there a connection that you can draw? Has it been pretty random? What can you share? Anything that you feel comfortable.
Yeah, totally. So I've always been someone who just gets very into setting goals and then trying to hit them, like, from a very early age. And as a young person, for me, that kind of manifested in sports. I just I remember as like a 7-year-old, or 7, 8, I think is when I started, like, getting up early at 6 a.m. and going and practicing tennis with my dad, and then going to school, and then practice every day. And I played other sports too, but tennis is sort of the one that I kind of had the most kind of traction with. And I did that for years, like until I was around 12, and I ended up being ranked like 17th in the nation for the 12 and unders or something. And it was just and I actually say that because what I found was, and this is one of the formative learnings that has stuck with me the rest of my life, is I didn't actually really like tennis very much, which is funny to say. But I remember like when it would rain, I would almost be happy. I wouldn't need to play. And I think what I really learned from that was that it's not just about kind of, it's really easy to get stuck and just kind of working really hard towards an objective without kind of taking a step back and be like, is this the objective that I actually care about? Is this what I want to be putting my time towards? And I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people about the career they're in, and they kind of just say, well, I kind of landed here by accident. And it's like, sometimes that's a great thing. Sometimes it's exactly where you want to be, but a lot of times it's not. And so what that really taught me, and I remember this whole thing, I was just, little 12-year-old, and, that was, I was doing this tennis thing, and that was, it starts to become a little bit of your identity. And I remember I just stood up to my parents, stood up to I was like, I'm not going to do this anymore. My tennis coach, I don't really want to do this. This is actually not what I want to do. And I hard pivoted into team sports and then doing other things. And I was much happier than I worked just as hard, but I worked hard towards something else. And anyway, it was just, it's been formative for me. I'm not very, like, as a, frankly, even as a teenager and as an adult, I've always aimed to be very deliberate about what do I want? What is the outcome I'm trying to drive? Where do I see myself? Where do I want to be? And then that has really, again, helped me focus on where I'm putting my time. So that definitely very formative childhood experience.
That is really interesting. I mean, you were really young when you started being very intentional and deliberate. Was this just natural in you? Was there something that you saw other people around you that influenced you? Like, it's a very hard concept, right? Like, even adults, we struggle with this.
I mean, honestly, I think I learned it through that experience with tennis, where I just kind of felt like, I think I did have, and you have a bit of an organic kind of strain of wanting to put a lot into something. So I think that's sort of just a part of who I am. I just like to kind of do that, to work hard towards an objective. But that really was a learning I got from that experience, because in order for me to change, I had to put a lot of elbow grease into it. A lot of my life, even as a young person, was oriented around tennis. I'd practice every single day with multiple, I had a coach. I was traveling for tournaments. There's a lot that you need to do, kind of get your ranking, maintain your ranking. And, it was, so it really was a big part of my life. And so in order to shift out of it took a ton of deliberation, took a ton of effort. I mean, I needed to explain it to my parents, who were like, is this just because you want to hang out with your friends, which I did. Like, I remember things that I missed. But it wasn't that. It was that I wasn't passionate about tennis. I was just doing it. And so it really came from that, where I just found myself, happened to be at a young age, but I think it happens to folks at various times, where I was just putting a lot of time into something that maybe other people could look at and say, oh, that's a great objective. Like, you good job. But for me personally, was not actually what I wanted to do. And so that really was it. I mean, and I kind of did fall into tennis. I started playing, and then I had I'm quite tall. It's hard to tell from, when we're sitting, but I've always been tall. I'm like, on a good day, 5'11". I've always been tall. So that helps. So it's some kind of organic stuff that helped me be good, better as a younger person. But I really did. I fell into it, spent a ton of time doing it, drove some outcomes that other people felt good about, and that I felt good about in a general sense of achieving something, but wasn't what I wanted. And that really was it. That was the formative learning. And it wasn't something I sought to learn, or that I kind of put myself in a deliberate path. It's just sort of something that fell upon me, which I think it does. Like, we end up working hard towards stuff that just is in front of us. And then I just happened to get that a little bit earlier, and but hanging on to that learning has helped. I can't tell you how many times in my life I've, as a result of that experience, really sharpened the pencil on what I care about and make sure I'm putting my energies towards those things.
And it is so relatable to your career as well, because I think some of the themes that I caught as you were sharing that is putting in the hard work, because obviously there is no, as much as I think the common pop psychology tells us, you don't have to work hard. I think you do need to put in the effort. You do need to think in retrospect and be intentional about it. And it's also about the discipline. And I think all of these, among other things, kind of compound over time to kind of shape. And I think Steve Jobs had said this. I believe I might be misquoting, but a lot of times I think when you are thinking forward, a lot of stuff is not going to make sense. But then when you look backwards, I think they all kind of connect as really nicely connected, cohesive story. So thank you for sharing that, Laura.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's right. I think for most things that we really care about, it does require, or often requires, hard work and elbow grease. The good news is if it's something you really do care about, it feels like, it's still hard work, but it feels like the good kind of hard work, right? And that's really and that's what allows you to then want to work harder. There's definitely things in my life where I've worked hard and finished and, wrapped up that work or wrapped up a project and felt super fulfilled. There's the times where you work hard and you feel exhausted, in a way where it doesn't feel like the healthy kind, right? And it almost always is connected to, what is this outcome driving? What is this giving to me? And if it's not giving you that return, it can really change. So same amount of energy, same amount of work, but the outcome changes everything about how it feels.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I know we're seeing some questions come in, so I will take those in just a few minutes, but let's kind of start with your current life.
Yeah.
And so what does a typical day being a VP of growth at DigitalOcean look like? If you can maybe just give us a glimpse for folks who might be interested in this career. And do you see differences in your role currently and how it was and what you had to do, let's say in Twillio or Amplitude? Because all of these companies are in different times, different spaces. They were probably at different stages of their growth journey themselves. So do you want to maybe share a little bit?
Yeah, totally. So I'll start with sort of what my day looks like today, and then I can kind of parse out what are some of the similarities and differences. So the numbers. Always a day starts with looking at the dashboard. I'm sure it's not a shocker to folks who are in growth. As dashboard with all the key numbers, crack it open, look at it. Is there any surprises, anything going on? That's usually a starting place because at the end of the day, right? And that's one of the reasons I like growth is so connected to the outputs. Whereas, some other roles, like if you're a product manager of a specific product, or you're, owning a particular piece of a business, you tend to have your anchor or allegiance to, a block of code or a particular project. Growth, your allegiance is to that dashboard. That is what, if you're doing a good job, the numbers are going up. If something's off, they're going down. Like it's a very numbers outcome driven place to be. And so every day starts with the dashboard, and that often then will yield follow-ups. Hey, this, like, we thought this might recover, maybe this wouldn't. And then typically there's a few things that we already know are areas that we need to work on, something that's red or yellow towards objectives. And often my days and weeks are about leaning into those things. So, for example, maybe there's maybe we've got, downstream or onboarding conversion metrics are looking strong, but maybe our top of funnel or total signups is looking down. And so, or maybe it was high last month, low this month. And so then maybe I'll spend some of the day kind of following up on those projects, connecting, brainstorming. And again, it's a very, as a growth leader, I've always found it's so important to be able to, again, look at the high level and be like, hey, generally, where is the ship going? But then also get super into the weeds with the team and be a backboard and, offer suggestions, see what you've seen. There's a lot of patterns when it comes to growth, which we can get into as well. But it's part of, that's definitely how my day-to-day goes. Start with the dashboard. Typically there's things that are already kind of known to be red or yellow, and that's where I'll put my time, both from a high and low perspective, the details and the top. And those kinds of things are relatively consistent across the board. Now, what might be red or yellow might change or differ, but that's typically how that goes. I'll say one other thing that is almost always consistent in every growth role that I've been in is, growth is a team sport. It's one of the reasons I love it. There's literally, when you think about growth, right? There's some top of funnel stuff going on. There's some onboarding stuff. There's some retention stuff. All of those things are touched by other people at the company. There's no such thing as a project or product or ship or campaign or anything that a growth team will release that doesn't have some other compounding factors from other teams. And so the way I always like to describe it to my teams is every single day, other people are either harming your metrics or helping your metrics. And so part of what you need to do to be successful is to make sure that you're seeing more help than harm. And so I'll say another part of what I find I do in my day-to-day, week to week, and is consistent is truly just kind of truly like cross-team relationships. Like I can't even tell you how often there have been like teams that I've worked with who are maybe not used to operating with a growth team, or maybe, you know, in the way that we need to optimally move the metrics. And so just helping everyone align around the same things and catching when there's misalignment. There's almost always some of that. And we can get into that too. There's some really great ways you can use operations and North Star data to empower folks to work well together without the kind of manual touch points, but there's always still some of that. But yeah, so some similarities there, some differences across the board, but yeah, I'll also say stage. You know, you mentioned, Bosky, that stage makes a big difference. You know, DigitalOcean is a little bit more mature in their journey. There's still, you know, plenty of new things going on, but can definitely say my day-to-day at Twillio, when I started, we were maybe around 100 million revenue, or tens of millions, high tens of millions, to when it was 2 billion in revenue, right? Annual revenue when I left in 2022. Like very different experiences there, like almost incomparable. But looking at the data every day, being super aware of the red and yellows are, having a clear plan for those, making every week about improving those. That is always been in relationship management, being team operations, getting teams to work well together. Those have been very consistent.
So one thing that I was kind of thinking about as you were answering that question is the alignment piece. I think I'm just going to bring that question right now.
Yeah.
Aligning people, I mean, the word is so simple, but it's extremely hard. And I think it's also highly cultural as well. I think some teams, some companies, they really work together and, you know, they'll hash it out everything. I definitely saw that in Atlassian, like low ego and very meritorious and everything, but would really work wonderfully. I mean, we had conflicts, but it wasn't something that we would dread. So I think there's a difference between conflict and politics and territorialness. And so any tips, any advice on how to navigate this? You know, whether you're in a growth, like if you're in a growth team, if you're even in a product team, you have to work with bringing other people in. Like, how do you deal with those dependencies across so many different teams? And how do you help in that relationship building? Any tip or advice for our listeners today?
Yeah, the secret weapon to great alignment is great operations. And by operations, some people, when they hear that, mean, oh, meetings. And no, what I mean by that is actually data and metrics. So part of the friction that comes from teams not being able to align well, there's, you know, the cultural stuff that's either going to work for or against. You can't always like change the culture, but what you can do always, and what people are always organically motivated to do, is to work with people who are working towards similar objectives as them. And oftentimes when I see misalignment happen between teams, other than some of the cultural stuff that you can't always control, the stuff that you always can control, I see teams get mixed up, is lack of clarity around what the shared objectives are. And so it turns into feeling like, oh, I'm coming to you with dependencies. I need you to do something so I can succeed. It's kind of that statement, right? Or it feels like favors, like, hey, can I ask you to do this for me or to unblock? And whenever you're in an environment where there's not clear shared objectives, you'll always end up leaning on those kinds of partnerships where it's kind of favor-oriented, dependency-oriented. And then, you know, when someone's doing something for you, it's more in the zone of I'm doing this for you instead of I'm doing this together as partners to drive a shared objective. So strong operations can help here, and it doesn't have to be complicated. It can be very simple. One of my favorite weapons of choice for great operations is just a scorecard with North Star. And you start with yourself first. Don't worry about anybody else. Start with yourself. If you're a leader, start with your team. If you're not, start with you and what it is that you are aiming to do, and can tease out actually a lot of really interesting debate and discussion, which is very healthy and drives clarity as to what actually the purpose of you and your role is. But start with a scorecard, which means, what is the North Star? What is it if I could choose like kind of one thing that I could 10x this quarter, this year? What would that be? And it's always a great exercise. You can, if you're not sure between three, just ask yourself, if I could only choose one, which would it be? And it often drives clarity. But you have that kind of North Star, and then you have the underlying metrics you think is going to drive that. And bam, it doesn't have to be perfect. You just start with what you know. And now you've got a scorecard. Now you've got something that you can actually go to another leader with, or even another IC or an individual, and say, look, this is what my Q1 is all about, or my year is all about. These numbers in this. If it's not here, I'm not focused on. If it is here, I'm thinking about it every single hour of every single day. Does anything on here line up with what you and your team or you personally care about? And guaranteed, and this always happens, people are like, oh yeah, we need to drive that too, because that's a key input to my metric. And yeah, if that doesn't grow, we're going to be toast. And so they're like, oh, great. Okay. Why don't we then get our teams together and we can share a scorecard, right? And then from there comes, something like, oh, like maybe you meet with someone, they say, oh, well, these retention things you're looking at, we care about this too. Bam, you can create a retention pod that has folks from both teams. Now you've got a group of people who have a single shared outcome. And so instead of them needing to kind of cross each other at night, like you're relying on ICs or individuals to constantly negotiate dependencies and ask them something, there's no ask. You're just in it together as a team. So whenever, it's one of the first things I do whenever I join a new company, is I make darn sure that we're really clear on what the outputs are in the form of metrics. We have a clear understanding of input metrics, which, by the way, doesn't mean that we have it all perfectly down. Then we clearly know we have a gap or a misunderstanding, but we start with something and then go and connect with other leaders and say, hey, look, where do you match up, so that I can organize folks together well. And again, it just, irrespective of the cult, and that's always a boon if everyone's like nice and likes to work together. But even irrespective of that, it always up levels the alignment, gets people working well together, even without any manual intervention or relationship building or anything like that.
I just love it. And it becomes less emotional. It becomes less political, right? Because no one is trying to trump each other up. It's like, I did this for you last time. Now you need to do this for me. And I think that's where it kind of gets.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask a follow-up question, because I think a lot of folks might be working in environments where maybe they just receive a list of projects from the top. Everything is predefined. And yes, you can still sit down. Like, I firmly believe as an IC, like I've had to sit down and build something where I can identify, like, okay, what can I move here within my purview of control? But it's really, really hard when you've been just given a list of projects that maybe it makes sense on top, but in your level, you're kind of not being able to connect, and you just see them as discrete projects that you have to work on. What would your advice be in that situation? Is there something similar, or do you need to tweak this, the operation and the mechanics of North Star?
Yep, for sure. So there's two fundamental paths that you can take on this one. One is if you have a manager that is outcome driven, or if you have a manager that is not. If you have a manager that's outcome driven, this is the time to sit down with them and partner and drill and say, hey, look, great list of projects. Let's partner together on what success means for each of them based on outcomes, not delivery. And if you have an outcome driven manager, you pair up together and you knock it out together and you say, okay, in your PRDs, in your documents, and however you're teeing up your projects, bam, very tip top of it is project name and number one purpose in terms of metric output, right? Path two, you don't have an outcome driven manager. That is always a challenge. And if you are a manager and you're thinking like, I kind of just give my team's list of projects, this I would say would be my number one suggestion to you, is start to get them to be outcome driven and make sure that when you give them the project, they understand the connection, not just so that they can be more successful, but so that you can show how your team is delivering business goals. And if you're not sure, go up to your manager, right? It continues to go up. But in that case, let's say you have a manager that is not outcome driven. No reason that you can't go into your documents and you can assert what you think the core outcome is. And what's great about that is once it's documented and it's front and center there, well, suddenly now people might have some thoughts about it. And that triggers really good discussion, because it's only really when somebody has something written down like that that it becomes such a reality about the anchor of the project. And here's what I'll also say. Aside from that being a way to drive alignment and good operations and be outcome driven, all that, it drives prioritization. It's very hard to deliver a project optimally when you don't know how to make trade-offs, because there always have to be decision points. Are we going to cut this, or are we going to cut that? Are we going to invest in this, or are we not? And the only real way to make consistent, clear, fast decisions along those lines is if you know what the project is for, meaning what's the outcome. And if you don't know that, then every time you make those decisions, it's much more opinion driven. Sometimes it can even be random. Sometimes it can be based on what other teams can do or not do. And then you don't even know if it's worth, is that a problem that they said no? Like, it makes having the clear outcome drives all kinds of great efficiencies within your own project, even outside of alignment.
I love this because it is very tangible, and it is something that I think every single person in a company should be able to do at least their bit within what they can control, right? So I think there are these like three circles, spheres of influence, and there are a lot of things that you cannot change culturally, I think, in the company, but there's all these things that you can do. And I am so grateful for one of the managers. Like, I was working in this really large, very bureaucratic company years ago, and I was really getting frustrated because I was like, I want to show at the end of the year, like, we keep on having these conversations about performance reviews, like, what did you move? Like, what did you do to move the needle? And I'm like, I'm not moving the needle. And it was a very interesting, as much as frustrating conversation. And he said, what if you reframe some of the things that you're doing at your control, because you cannot change a 800,000 employee company. Like, you can't change what is happening, but you can change. And slowly, as I was starting to have these conversations with different people, just like what you said, different people jumped in and it just started spreading. And suddenly, as a team, we up leveled very quickly, and we were doing things very differently. We were refusing project requests that were coming in. And yeah, it doesn't have to be that complicated.
That's right. And I think that's the key, is good practice spreads. Like, very rarely, if you're experiencing something like this, are you the only one. It's almost always the case where if you're in a situation where you're feeling your hand at a list of projects, that probably the person to the left of you and to the right of you and across the aisle and across the org might also be in those shoes. And so if you start to crack the code on it and adjust, that's exactly what you'll find, is people like, oh, well, I want to add the North Star or key output to the top of my doc too. And it just starts to, again, really allow you to influence the business beyond just your core area. So yeah, absolutely. Good practice absolutely can spread. And it's really great also, and fulfilling and great for career growth, to be someone who drives that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's talk about maybe a company that wants to spin up a growth team. I mean, everyone wants to have a growth team, right? Like, it's crazy. What do you think? Like, when is the right time? Like, how do you know? Like, if you are a founder or a CEO, how do you know? What are some of the symptoms you should be seeing in the company that makes you like, yeah, now is the time to invest?
Yeah, for sure. And it's a great question, because a lot of times folks think that they need a growth person, but really they're just pulling someone in to really help them solve product market fit. Like, maybe the product that they have is actually not really quite a good match, but then they pull in somebody in growth to kind of solve that problem. And growth folks are going to be able to take something that has product market fit and scale it and grow it. But until you find product market fit, it's going to be harder to invest in a growth team, or it's going to give you less return, right? Now, that said, as I mentioned, people who are great at growth tend to be pretty good at building businesses. So what I actually see happen sometimes is people will join as a growth person and realize there's a product market fit problem, and they'll just jump right in and figure that out. But if you're a founder and you're trying to figure these things out, you want to just ask yourself, have I created a product that resonates with a clear market? Meaning stuff like, Have they shown a willingness to buy? Have I seen retention, right? Retention is such a key. Paying and staying, right? Do I have people paying and staying? And do I have a clear perspective on who that market is, and maybe even some ideas about who the next market is? That's a really great time to bring in a growth person, because that person's going to be able to say, oh, okay, you clearly have fit with this part of the market. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to scale up within that market. And then together we're going to figure out what that might mean for how we can go kind of adjacent, right? But if you pull on a growth person and you haven't found that resonance yet, then all hands should really be back on deck to be doing very fundamental learnings. Okay, if we don't have fit, is it because we haven't found, we're not actually solving a problem? Is it because we are putting it in front of the wrong people? Maybe we're solving a problem, but not their problem, right? So that really should be the first step. Growth can come in and kind of scale that fit.
Got it. And is a growth team a single person team, or are there ICs as well? Like, what have you typically seen?
Yeah, I've seen so I've seen a bunch of things, right? I mean, the reality is that, as you mentioned, growth is is sort of a hot topic, and it's grown really fast. I mean, it's still, like I said, I mean, I was doing growth, 15 plus years ago, and we didn't have a name for it. I mean, that is not it's not that long, right, to have anything around. So it means is even people who've been in growth for even a few years are some of the most advanced or the most experienced, right? Which is not typical of most roles, where that they've just been around longer. So all to say, I see growth teams evolve and show up in so many different ways at companies, but very often, we talked about the kind of founder stage where they, it's just a very small team and they're hiring their first growth person. And often you do want to pull in someone to kind of lead the charge on it. And then they'll kind of tell you and investigate, like, hey, actually what we need based on we need to scale is this or that. And it can be very different based on who your fit is with and who your market is and your resonance. But beyond startups, so once, companies who are a little bit larger thinking about this, there is almost never a time where I see companies at a later stage and there isn't someone already doing growth. Even if they don't have the title, even if they're not kind of considered a growth person, there's almost always somebody who's thinking about onboarding. Maybe it's not their core thing. Maybe they're a product manager of a core product, but they've realized that in order for that to grow, they need to be thinking about how to segment customers and make sure they're getting the right ones over, thinking about a seamless experience, thinking about, well, gosh, kind of need to give them something for free before they decide they're going to buy, because they say they're not ready to buy until they get value. So there's almost always somebody at the company who's doing growth. It's often just kind of hidden or a side project or part of remit. And so one of the first things that that companies should do who are thinking about this is first just take a look at the people who are there. There, I'm sure, is at least a few people at the company already doing this stuff. And so often a good first step is just to bring those folks together. Sometimes someone who's doing that organically, that's a career interest for them. So it's a great way to retain people, up-level them. And then once you've kind of assembled that force kind of together, then you can get a sense of what do you need, right? Okay, what are your actual gaps? Because clearly you've got some things filled. And often those folks are the ones who have a pretty good idea of what's needed. So you kind of pair the needs of the overall business, the kind of high level understanding of the areas of opportunity with the boots on the ground perspectives of what's getting in their way and what they're hearing from customers. And that tends to yield some obvious next steps to take.
Awesome. And what skills, both from, let's say, an IC who is working on some aspects of growth, and what skills would you look for, let's say, in a head of growth?
Yeah. So across the board, my favorite thing to look for with really any hire in growth, and probably honestly in anything that I would do, but definitely in growth, is just like a doer mentality. So the reality of growth, I mean, I mentioned before, it's a team sport, it's horizontal. And sometimes the biggest opportunity is in retention, and sometimes it's in onboarding, and sometimes it's in acquisition. And so especially when it's a smaller team, but even once it matures, like the reality is it takes a lot of different skill sets to succeed in growth. And it can change quarter to quarter, month to month, depending on what the metrics are doing and how the market's changing. And so the folks who do best in growth, I think, are just organic doers. Like they see a wall and their instinct is, how can I get over it? How can I get through it? How can I solve it? They're folks who just are kind of ready to roll up their sleeves. And what's great about that is sort of inevitable in growth that you're going to run across blockers like that. But it's also such a great way to learn because, again, when you're outcome driven with growth, always has its allegiance to metrics versus like a particular product or a particular piece of the pie. They're looking at the customer journey, and so they're inherently connected to outcomes. So you combine that kind of role with someone who's a doer, and you just tend to see some really good takeoff. But yeah, and in a growth leader, I look for somebody. So it's across the board at just any kind of growth role. But in a growth leader, I look for someone who can really bring people together, work across the aisle, and put together a clear strategy. Because one of the things that can happen in growth is one of the great things is you can kind of go anywhere to move the metrics. But then one of the challenging things is you can go anywhere to move the metrics, which means it's very, very easy for teams to get overwhelmed and to be not knowing what to say no to, not knowing what to say yes to. And so leaders need to be very clear. We are doing this, like this is the opportunity, not that, or not yet. Doers, leaders are doers who have a very clear competency at strategy, meaning they can be very deliberate about what we're doing and what we're not doing.
Okay, perfect. That's a really, really, I think it's a very, very, really awesome perspective. It's also very simple because it breaks down a lot of things into like very common sense stuff, right? So this is what I really loved about your answer, Laura. I was talking with someone and she said that she is already working in a company and they're kind of tackling, whether they can distribute some of the experimentation and growth work to optimize some of the retention and move the numbers. And she said someone told her from the leadership team, I don't want you to be doing all the cutesy stuff. I just want you to do like hack this stuff out so that we can basically start making money. So I was remembering when you were talking about, can you help our listeners draw the distinction between the term or the phrase growth hacking that had really become very famous? I don't even remember like when, but yeah, it was at some point, I think. Yeah. And then growth, how it is now, PLG, just very briefly, just kind of maybe connect the dots here for folks.
Yeah, for sure. So I think there's a good light of growth hacking, and I think there's a darker light of growth hacking. Always beware when someone who's never done growth before is saying do growth hacking, because it almost always means on the hood what they really just mean is move the metrics fast, and then they just give it that kind of label because that's kind of the energy is, well, we'll just go be scrappy and just fix it. Is kind of the thing. In reality, an excellent growth roadmap is big rocks, pebbles, sand. For those who haven't heard that before, basically, the idea is that there's some sort of obvious big things, maybe you validated it in other ways, bigger changes that you need to make in order to drive growth. There's some things that are kind of, smaller, medium amount. Maybe they don't take like a month or two to build. Maybe it's more like a week and requires a little bit of elbow grease. And then there's sand where it's like, well, that copy's obviously broken, or that's out of date, or, hey, we need to have a clear CTA for this. No one knows how to find it. Then there's sand. And so when we talk about like growth hacking, right? So those kind of quick wins, there can be some very healthy quick wins in the form of sand that should be happening all of the time, right? And what I love about those is not only do they often move the metrics, but they yield such great learnings because this is my favorite stat in the whole, and I love stats. This is my favorite stat in the whole world, which is that over 80% of experiments fail. It's like there's literally scientific studies done on this from companies like very successful, Microsoft, Netflix, companies very, very successful have tried to challenge this. Like, it can't possibly be 80%. And it is. Sometimes it's higher. Actually, I think Netflix is like 90% failure rate. 90. So it's quite high. And so if growth hacking is thought of in the terms of, well, let's be scrappy and get things out in the form of kind of a healthy balance of sand and pebbles, great. You need to learn because things are going to fail. So you have to ship fast. But never do you ever want to be caught in a scenario where you're trapped in a world where you only are doing sand, because you're not going to, at some point, those sand and pebbles going to help indicate to you what the big rocks are. And if you want to have the really big growth, you really need the collection. So if anyone is coming to you and saying, just growth hack, you can go back to them and say, yeah, love the idea of quick wins. Here's how I'm thinking about the growth roadmap, where there's going to be some quick wins, some sand, some pebbles, and some rocks. And while maybe some people aren't as familiar with growth, often people are familiar with that terminology. So again, you can kind of like educate up a little bit with things that they know and bringing it back to growth, which is new for them.
Love it. Absolutely love it. I'm going to take one audience question here. Behavioral psychology. And so it's a very important thing if you're trying to change behaviors of users that you are trying to improve or make them do less of or more of. Do folks have to, like, I absolutely dig anything related with behavioral science and cognitive science, but do you actually have to learn all of this? Like, do you absolutely need to learn? And if you are a growth person or you're leading or working on any of the growth initiatives, or is there some common sense way to figure this out? Like, what is the role of behavioral science in all of this?
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing, right? It's how do you move the numbers? You solve people's problems. How do you understand people's problems? Well, there's an infinite list of things you can do to do that. Is understanding basic user psychology one of them? Definitely. But in the same way that there's, that is a means to understand how people operate, what motivates them, what drives, gets them to value and all that. There are, it's just an arrow in the quiver. That said, I'll answer this in two different ways. One, like how I've seen user psychology manifest and growth be really critical for some of the success that I've driven, some of the things that have been effective, but then also like very tactically, how can you go out and get some of those insights without needing to go and get a psychology degree? But that happened to me. My major was in psychology. And so like that was one of those, you mentioned when you look backwards, everything ties together. That is one of those that does tie for me. But actually, on the first one, kind of patterns in growth, there's some very basic kind of user behavior, psychological things that I've seen just manifest at every company I've been at and companies I've advised, which is just stuff like people tend to be more likely to spend money if they have received value. They are more likely to get through friction if they have motivation to do so. Now, these seem like, well, of course, like in one ear, out the other, of course. But it is so easy to not manifest it in how you're thinking about your experience. There's shows up in so many ways. One thing I love to ask people to do as a way to kind of test how well their company is sort of manifesting these very basic user psychology principles into their business. Take a look at your pricing and packaging. Tell me if you are asking users to make really big leaps from one sort of area of spend or one tier to the next one without giving them any sense of what the value is of doing it other than a sales conversation. And even then, with a sales conversation, like, is that the only thing stringing them between paying you $100 a month and $1,000 a month or more? Very often, that's the case. Or two, go through onboarding experience, or better yet, watch someone new go through it. Like, what is motivating them to go through the arduous process of learning something new? What do they get? Like, it's always fun to do like kind of a motivation versus kind of dollars. And like, when do they get to do kind of like an honest, just like scratch graph of like when the value actually shows up for them? And you realize like, wow, kind of asking them to do a lot before they get anything from us. But anyway, so I'll just say basic principles like that apply just about everywhere else. One more that I'll just surface, which is another one of my favorite, like very tactile things that anybody here could go do, is take a look at your sign up flow. What questions are you asking them before they get to any value? And before you do what the CEO might tell you to do, this has literally happened, like probably every single job I've been at, this has happened, where they say, hey, just remove the questions. It's friction. Let's just kill the questions. Actually, no, user psychology, that is actually not the right thing to do. Instead, include the questions that are user value oriented. Remove the ones that are business oriented. No one likes to come in and tell you how much money they have to spend on your product, or if they're ready to spend yesterday or next week or a year from now. They do want to answer questions like what their use case is, or what product they're interested in, or if they're exploring or they already know what they want to do. People, I actually, one of my favorite experiments ever, ran into Twillio, added more questions to the sign-up flow, didn't change a lick to onboarding, just added more questions, improved conversion rate 5% through the sign-up flow. Added friction, in theory, improved conversion rate. Why? User psychology. There's friction where people are getting value. Like because when they're answering those questions, what it was actually doing was reaffirming they're in the right place, made them feel more connected to the brand. Like, oh, you get me, you know what I want, we're aligned here, right? So motivating friction versus, because all the questions were like, hey, like, what's your tell me about your technical skill set, so that what are you coding in? Yeah, it was use case product. So those were the questions. So anybody can go into your sign up flow right now, take a look and be like, literally just do it like a 10-minute audit. Is this user value focused? Is this user value focused? Is this going to make them feel like, yes, confirmed, I'm in the right place? Or is this going to make them feel like we're after their money and they just want to get sales connected to us, or ignore us completely if we answer wrong? And you can literally go in and just make some changes. Anyway, so all to say, those are some that I've seen be universal across in growth across companies. But don't feel like you gotta go get a psychology degree or what have you. The great news is there's a lot of people that share about their these things. The few that I've mentioned, those are ones that I've shared, but also some amazing podcasts, newsletters by growth people. Lena Verna, of course, has a great one. Leah Theron's got some great stuff. So don't feel like you need to go and recreate the wheel or go get a degree. Like, you can just benefit from learning from what other people have seen by leveraging user psychology and behavioral psychology as an arrow in the quiver of growth.
Thank you. I absolutely love it. And thank you for sharing, because I was receiving some personal messages from folks to ask you this question. So absolutely love it. I want to switch the gears a little bit to career. And the question that I wanted to ask is, let's say, a lot of people are thinking about what's happening to their role, their field. Should we leave? Should we? So let's say someone just has 30 minutes a week to focus on their career growth, right? Their personal career growth. What is the one thing that you believe that they should maybe stop doing? And maybe one thing that they should start thinking about doing, or maybe doing?
Yeah. So this is, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but at least I'm consistent. I'm going to say the most important thing, whether you have 30 minutes, 2 hours, 10 minutes to dedicate every week, the number one thing you want to do is be really clear about what success is. What's the outcome you want to drive? Career growth. Career growth can mean, I want to make more money. I want this title. I actually want to get out of this industry entirely. I want to move into developing this craft, or I'm doing these 3 things, but I really want to develop this skill. Career growth can mean any of those things. And what often I find happens is people don't actually sit down to think about, what's my stack rank of those? It's like, well, I want all of them. Okay, sure. But for career growth to kind of optimally happen, you need to really be prescriptive about what you want the most, because that can change a lot of where you put those 30 minutes into. So that's one. But then 2, and this is just kind of general advice that you don't need to, this isn't even the 30 minutes you reserve for it. This is just an everyday in and out kind of thing, is be an outcomes driven person. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but as long as you are always bringing it back to outcomes, a couple of things happens. One, you can have a really clear view of how the work that you're doing is driving business goals, which is a lot of things. It makes it easier for your manager to talk about how you're doing that, right? So you might have a great manager who, as a tailwind for you, makes it easier for career growth, or maybe a bit of a dud who makes it harder. Either way, you being outcome driven is going to increase your odds, right, of that growth. The second thing that being outcome driven every single day, every single minute, as opposed to kind of the 30-minute focus is you're going to learn the right skill sets. It's like that puts you into the right gym, right? You are working out the right muscles if you are outcome driven. It means that when you come across a wall that's preventing you from driving a metric forward, you learn the skills to get around the wall, which then will help you the next time. So then you get better and better and better at being outcome driven. And so even if you have a bit of a dud of a manager, you as a person are developing the skills you need to be an asset to a business, which will help you help them as much as you can to make the case, but more importantly, will make you an asset across the board, because a lot of times our career aspirations diverge from the companies we're at. And by building up that skill set, you become more valuable to maybe the future place where you're going to work, which is going to bring actually the career growth that you want.
I love this so much, because I think a lot of times when you kind of are feeling confused about what's next for you, I think it's very natural, maybe for a lot of people, to feel like, okay, there's nothing here. I just need to go outside and look. But then, the interviewing and all of that, I mean, that itself is hard. So then we stay here feeling wretched, but then not knowing what we can do. So I think comes back because it makes you look at whatever the problem that you're having very objectively. And this is a conversation I have with a lot of folks as well. And reminds me of the story I think you had shared when we first talked months ago about how you went and pitched for a role that did not exist.
Yes.
Right. And I think this is what I talk about. Like, sometimes you can create career opportunities for yourself.
Totally.
A lot of times there are caps about, for how many titles and levels can be. And sometimes you may need to shift it. I've certainly done that quite a few times. Do you want to share that story about how you created that opportunity for yourself for folks who might not have heard that?
Yeah, for sure. And so this is a great example of the outcome driven thing. So I actually joined Twillio in 2014, leading product marketing for our messaging lines. I was very excited about that. It was, it was going to be a, little bit of a change of pace and whatever. But what I found after I joined was, again, I started, looking, what are the metrics that I can impact? What are the most important ones that I can impact? And then I even took a lens outside of like my role. It's like, as a business, like where are we at? What do we need? And in order to, one of the things I did to kind of unpack that as I started talking to customers, looked at data, but then also talked to customers. What I found really quickly was we had a really big gap in our onboarding experience. We had a lot of like very vocal fans. And then that kind of led to almost a complacence of, oh, like we're really easy. People just get it. But when you actually talk to customers, especially as we sort of were growing, I'm getting more and more people be like, this is really hard. Your onboarding experience sucks. I have no idea what's going on. I couldn't find what I needed, like the laundry list. And nobody was focused on that. No one. And so in my role, in my role as the PMM for messaging, I was really looking and talking to messaging customers, and I was unpacking that and seeing that, hey, in order for us to build up this business, like we got to figure this out. And so I started to, so a couple of things happened. So this was one of those moments where like, I'm an output driven person. This is going to drive the business forward. So I'm going to check the box on some of the things I have in my role, but I'm really going to push on this one because that's what's needed to grow our messaging business. We need to improve our onboarding. And so I started to share out the voice of the customer learnings that I was getting. It evolved into this monthly report with a quarterly live meetup where a CEO attended, and he literally required all of these senior leaders be there. And so it did a couple of things, right? And just started with something very simple, which is being output focused, which led me to talk to customers, which led me to find these findings, which led me to want to share them, which led me to this meeting, which led me to visibility. And so then when our annual planning process came around, I pitched it. I was like, hey guys, we need this. This is what's going to happen if we don't. This is what's going to happen if we do. Here's what customers are saying. And then I'd already done some of that in the previous role because there I'd been outcome driven too. I actually created my role there at Bandwidth in a very similar way. And so I already had built up some of that outcome driven muscle. And they're like, oh yeah, well, this is obvious. Of course we need this. So go ahead and do that. And it was great. And it all was very organic. And again, it started with just being output driven.
I love that story. I absolutely love that story because, again, it comes down to, I think, how we started today's conversation. And it's about what can you control and what can you do? And for that, you need to know where you want to go and what can you move, right? Like what is controllable. We're almost at the end, Laura. I had so many other questions to ask you, but as we are parting, is there like your personal favorite mental model or philosophy that you stand by anytime you're at this crazy fork, in life or work?
Yeah. Gosh, there's so many ways to answer that. I mean, I think again, like I'll continue to be a broken record. I think the key is don't be afraid to drop things or pivot away from things that aren't aligned with your objectives and the things that matter the most to you, whether it's professional or personal. It gets so easy to kind of stay the course. And often it's like, when we make that decision, we look back like, what did I do the last couple of years? Like, so be proactive about that, be deliberate about that, know what matters to you, ruthlessly prioritize those things. A lot of the right things will come out of that. So if you find yourself at a fork in the road, which implies there's a decision to make, just take a step back from the decision and just think about what do you want. It'll make it a heck of a lot easier to make that decision.
It comes back to outcome.
Yes, broken record for sure.
This has been so great, Laura. Again, thank you so much for giving us all this time to unpack so many of these topics. I absolutely loved it because it was such a no-nonsense approach to this, and I'm 100% confident that I think lots of people have absolutely gotten so much of insights learning from you. So thank you again so much. And thank you again, everyone, for joining. You'll be able to find the playback immediately, and we'll also be sharing some of these amazing snippets. I was taking notes of the time slots. When Laura shared something, I'm like, oh my God, like this is so cool. So again, thank you, everyone. Have an amazing, amazing day, and thank you again for joining. And Laura, thank you so much.
Thank you, and thanks everybody. Bye.